Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending what time you happen to be listening to this. Our guest today is Juliet Cardinal, who has written a fantastic book called An Irish Volunteer. Now, oddly enough, I'm actually sitting in a pub in Ireland as I record this, so if you have background noise, just pretend that this is a really high-tech production with special effects and everything. An Irish Volunteer is about the events that led directly to Irish independence, specifically the Easter Rising in 1916, with next year being its centenary celebration. So, welcome, Juliet Cardinal. How are you?
Really good. It's nice to talk to you.
Yes, it is. It's nice being heard, because we've had some technological issues, as God tends to do to us. So, what would you like the audience to know about An Irish Volunteer?
The Irish Volunteer, An Irish Volunteer was sort of it's my first novel, and it was a labor of love in a lot of ways. I have sort of a stressful job in my day job. I'm a private investigator, and I work for the defense teams in capital murder cases. So my clients are facing the death penalty. In 2009, I think I'd been doing the job for about 3 years, and the stress was starting to get to me, and I was starting to have some sort of panic attacks and anxiety things, and it was starting to really make me feel a little bit crazy. And in that state of mind, I got it into my head that if I went to Ireland and spent some time there, that would for some reason that would fix everything. And when I was a few weeks later, I was in Dublin, and I went on a tour of the Kilmainham jail and was able to hear some of the more personal stories of some of the leaders of the Rising. And I was completely just drawn in by that. I found them to be very compelling. The fact that they were a bunch of kind of a motley crew of poets and philosophers and professors and idealists, and they stood up against all odds, was just very inspirational to me. And of course, my book, An Irish Volunteer, focuses on the story of Joseph Plunkett and Grace Gifford within the context of the time of preparing for the Rising and during the Rising and a short part of the aftermath. And so that's what brought me to the story. So it was very important to me, and that motivated me to try to write my first novel, which, as you know, is not the easiest thing in the world.
Oh, gosh, no. And you did a wonderful job, for first novel. I certainly would have had no idea that it was a first. I would have thought that you've been doing historical fiction, for a decade or two. Of the major leaders of the Rising, which we'll let the audience know took place over 5 days, and it was ultimately unsuccessful, and all the leaders, were executed and so forth. But of the major leaders, why did you pick Plunkett to focus the novel on?
That's a really great question. One of the reasons is, at first I thought that I might focus on Grace when I first heard their story. Just, there's not a lot of women portrayed in history, and I thought that would be really great. And then I started to research them, and I just felt like I just related to him so much. I just came to be very compelled by him, his mysticism, his eccentricity, his idealism, and I kind of felt haunted by the whole personality. I just felt really strongly about him. And the other thing I realized when I researched is that, in my opinion, he doesn't get as much attention as he should, in comparison to Pierce and Connolly and a couple of the other guys that you hear a lot more about. And I really, however many people I can get to read my book, I just really wanted to get his story out there more. And I thought that their story as a couple was very beautiful and very tragic and romantic and idealistic. And I thought that would be a really great story to tell. It was also very attractive to me in my first book, because the drama and the story was already there. All I had to do was try to get out of the way and just try to clearly tell it the best I could, because it's such a beautiful story in itself.
Oh my, yeah, and there's so many complex complexities that go on there, and really, I think you chose well, because Plunkett and Gifford, their tragic love story really does encompass a lot of Ireland, and that Grace Gifford being born Protestant and converting to Catholicism, which that didn't go on a lot in those days or these days either, that you were able to bring in all these social issues to it,
Yeah, you're right. I had forgotten about that. That was a really great aspect of the relationship. I mean, she came from a family that was fully unionist and was very Catholic. Her dad was sort of quietly Catholic, but he kept it to himself. And the family was very Catholic, very, very pro-England. And that made everything that added a lot more tension to the story, and it a lot more drama, and she had to weigh that along with all her other choices she was making. The fact that her mother would surely turn against her, and that was very fascinating historically, and obviously really nice as a writer because it adds a lot. And her family's interesting because most of the daughters did similar things. Most of the daughters switched over to the nationalist cause, and many of them converted to Catholicism, and that was a very interesting family in general.
The mom, the way you drew her, and I'm totally assuming that you're accurate on this. She's a great character. I mean, my heavens, what a melodrama queen.
Yeah, I thought that she was great. There's a couple of books about her. I read, there's one called Grace Gifford Plunkett, and then one called Unlikely Rebels. That's about her and her sisters. And so I was able to learn a lot about her. And then because she was around, being very involved in the movement after the Rising, I was able to read a lot of her personal statements, which is very helpful. And then I read, many, many, many personal letters from Joe to her, which also really helped kind of learn more on a personal level about get a better feel for her and for him and for their relationship. And it added a lot more that I wouldn't have known just from the straight history books. That really, the straight history books really don't get a lot into their personal relationship and into their personalities.
Truly, yes, yeah. I don't want the people listening to this to think that this is a straight historical book, about battles, and so forth. Although you're writing about the actual scene in front of the General Post Office and so forth is brilliant. You write like a military historian on all that. But yeah, it is a very personal story. So you alluded to this, that you came to Ireland, for a bit of R&R and get away from the PI book and all that. Did you have a thought when you got here that I wonder if I'm going to find something to write a novel about? Like, what was writing in your head at all when you came here?
No, that's funny. I think just like a lot of Americans that have Irish ancestors, I just probably had Ireland romanticized in my head, and over many, many years wanted to go there and never had the chance. And it turned out to be in my kind of relatively insane state of mind, it actually turned out to be a great decision, because it was everything I hoped it would be when I went to Ireland. I didn't have a lot of specific expectations. It was just a feel. I didn't expect to fall in love with Dublin. I was headed for Galway. I just went to Dublin for a few days because that's where I flew into. Mm-hmm. And but no, that was the last thing on my mind. In fact, at that point, I was working many, many cases. I was working 60 or 70 hours a week, every week of the year, with no days off. And when I heard the story, the tour guides at the jail are really great. They're very knowledgeable and very passionate, and they're very inspiring. And I heard this story. They really focus on Grace and Joe and their story as a part of the tour. And I was asking the tour guide how I could find out more about these people, this particular Joe and Grace particularly. And I assumed that there was already a bunch of books written about them, and maybe there was a movie out, because it just seemed so dramatic and so perfect. And he said there really wasn't, that there was, there was a paragraph here and there about the relationship in the history books. And I felt like, I don't know, almost an obligation over the next year and a half. It was kind of growing in me. It was the last thing on earth I wanted to do. My dad was a writer, so it was always something in the back of my head that I would love to do, but it's intimidating. It's a huge thing to take on. Even though I've written hundreds and hundreds of pages of confidential investigative reports in my cases, I had never got more than a few pages into any novels. And so, no, it was the last thing in the world that would have occurred to me. I was just there for, I thought I'd get inspiration and like you say, R&R from sitting on a rock on Galway Bay and looking at the sea was really all I was looking for. And this ended up being a very unexpected gift from Dublin.
Yeah, it was Galway that did it to me too. Because I was brought here by my mom when I was 10. And I absolutely fell in love with the place the very first day, to the point that I said that I'm moving here. At some point, it took a few years to put the plan in action. But yeah, here we are. Yeah. It's a wonderful country. Coming back to the uprising, when I think, pardon me, when I think that a lot of people don't realize, and as we're heading into the 100th year next year, is that it's still controversial. There's still a huge swath of opinion, even in the Republic as opposed to the North, as to whether or not the Rising was even a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you bring that out in your book, that the guys, the leaders of the Rising, decided we have to do it now, otherwise Ireland is just going to be complacent and independence will never ever happen. Anything you'd like to say to that whole aspect of it, like when you were touring about the prisons and so forth, and doing your research, did you find certain ambivalence among the Irish you talked to about the Rising, or were they all, yes, it was a fine idea,
Yeah, that was. Sorry, siren just went by.
That's
that
quite
was
all right, so long as it wasn't for us.
Yeah, exactly. That's the good point. And again, I have to bring up the fact that I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm an American writing about something that is Irish, and that really I have very little perspective on. And I researched like crazy. I researched excessively. That's something that I really, really enjoy. That was one of my favorite things about writing the book, was learning about all of this. But I know that I have the impression that there are a lot of, in the Irish American community, there is a lot of tendency to romanticize things that were in reality for Irish people living at the time very, very tragic and difficult. And it's easy to be way over here and push people thousands of miles away to rebel and to sacrifice and to risk their lives. And so I think that anytime you're going, and the reason that they finally stopped the fighting is because too many civilians were being killed. I think that I don't think it's good to be a true believer on either side. And I tried to put that into the book, in that, I tried to, Joe was a thinker and a philosopher, and I tried to put a little bit of that, to show a little bit of that ambivalence about, how so many of the people at that time living in Dublin were outraged about what they were doing, and that it wasn't a black and white thing. It was very complicated, and nobody wants to go out there and get people killed. But I also felt that, being so intensely outnumbered and outgunned and being such complete underdogs, I also find that level of idealism and willingness to sacrifice their way of life to be very inspiring. And And so I was very drawn to that. So I don't think, again, I can't speak to that with any kind of authority, but I don't think that there was an easy answer for them, and I don't think it's an easy answer now. I do feel that it seems that they had waited a long time to go the political route, and they'd been promised home rule time and time again, and things were falling through once again. And when World War I came up, and the specter of conscription was on the horizon, and they were realizing they were going to be asked to sacrifice themselves once again for the British Empire, I think it just became too much, and it outweighed all of the cons about going through with something so extreme.
I agree with you, and I look at it from where I sit, having moved here 2.5 years ago, and I think it's all worked out fine. I think that the North was going to stick with Britain regardless. Because there is a strain of opinion that says that the Rising, doomed the division forever. Well, I think that was already in place. Are you planning on coming back for any of the 100th year celebrations and parades and speeches and all that fun stuff?
I would love that more than anything else. With my job, I can't plan things out very far in advance, but I am still doing the same work. But I have definitely considered going ahead and making plans in advance, because I'm sure things are going to be booked up very early. Making plans in advance, with the knowledge that it might fall through. And I would love to come. That would be wonderful. I can't even imagine how interesting that's going to be.
Truly, yeah. Because the newspapers are running supplements on every weekend and so forth, and the letters pages are full of that, and so on. Don't worry about places to say. Remember, people who live here. I can find you places in Dublin, so don't be worried about that.
That sounds like I'll have to commit to it then. And the other thing I think is important is, people talk about the Rising. Some people talk about the Rising as being a failure because they didn't get independence that week. But the way I see it is, they lost the battle and won the war. I think they sparked the movement that went on to the War of Independence and the Civil War, and that ended up with the Republic of Ireland existing at all. I don't know what would have happened if it wasn't for the Rising, and I don't see that they failed. And I would love nothing more than to be there and at the 100-year anniversary and get to stand in front of the GPO again. That would be overwhelming.
Oh, fantastic. Now, let's talk about the writing of. So you have the story, you're attracted to it, of Joe Plunkett and Grace Gifford and the Rising. How did you go about turning that? Well, okay, first off, even in terms of form, you chose to write it as a novel as opposed to nonfiction. How did that choice happen, and what was your process of writing it?
Yeah, that's really that's a really good question, because I felt that in certain ways, well-researched fiction can be more true than nonfiction, just when you're talking about human beings and their motivations and filling in blanks that you can't get in the history books. Now, of course, you're putting your own interpretation in there, and all you can do is do the best you can with your research and then interpret it the best you can. So it's not factual, but I wanted to be able to, after reading, I went to the National Archives, or at the National Library of Ireland, and read, all of Joe's notebooks and paperworks and letters and everything I could get my hands on, and all these books. And I wanted the freedom to be able to speculate a little bit about his motivations, and then reading his letters to Grace, I learned a lot more about their relationship, some of his insecurities that I hadn't even occurred to me just reading the straight history. And And the other thing I noticed is that not just with The Rising, with history books in general, there's so many different conflicting stories about what happened and why. And that was, in one way, that was a draw to make it a novel. And another way, it was a real complication, because you can't pick a middle ground with a novel. You can't say, well, some people believe this was the year that this happened. Some people believe this, or some people believe that the castle document was a forgery, and others believe that it was not. You have to just go with it. You have to pick one and go with it. And I felt that would be kind of a great project, and I felt that I could communicate at least what I felt Joe was like, and what I felt Grace was like best through a novel, just because I could take their letters and then use those to create private conversations that there were no witnesses for, so you can't really do that in a nonfiction.
Sure, the funny thing about writing historical fiction is that you tend to end up in a crossfire, that the historians say that you're making things up, and the literati say that, oh, well, it's easy. You're just writing down what was already there, so God bless you for doing it. I've never had a problem with it, because so long as it is heavily plausible that this is what Joe might have said to Grace, and vice versa and so forth, well, good enough. It doesn't matter if he said, at a certain point in a sentence, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that there would be, endless other versions of this story if somebody else is writing it, but I feel that I could make an argument for all of my choices. And like the castle document is a really good example. Still very controversial about the document. Was it a true document smuggled out of the castle or not?
Right.
And there are still people arguing about that. And I just had to read everything I could and then make a stand. And I don't know. I that is always an aspect, but I feel like one of the important things to me, besides people getting to know about Joe and Grace, was I wanted people who didn't know anything or much of anything about Irish history and the Rising to come out with a pretty decent understanding of at least the big picture and about what happened and why it happened. And I tried to research it extensively enough that it wouldn't be offensive to people who did already know the history. And to me, that was probably one of the hardest things, is to keep it simple enough as far as the history, explain things enough that somebody with no background would understand it enough that they could get the story, but also not simplify it so much that it would just be completely laughable to somebody who already knew the story. Yeah. And the other problem is there was so much that needed to be explained. In part, I have my book is in 3 parts, mm-hmm. And I think part 2 is better than part 1, and part 3 is better than part 2. And part of it is because in the first section, I just felt there was a need to explain the very complicated, although I think very compelling political scene in Dublin. And there was so much that needed to be explained. And I really tried to make that simple, because I felt like when I was reading the nonfiction history book, there seemed to be an assumption that people already knew quite a lot and already knew what different organizations stood for, and I tried to simplify it without being being annoying and going over the same stuff too many times. And I don't want to insult the reader's intelligence, but I also don't want to assume that they've already read 10 books on the Rising. I really wanted it to be available to anybody who just really wanted a good story.
You absolutely nailed it. Because even in your introduction, you basically give a short history of Ireland, and as soon as I read that, I thought that, oh, she's knocking this right out of the park. Because, yeah, it's exactly the level it needs to be. Because, you always have to assume that somebody who's picked up the book just has the vaguest idea of it all. In all truth, Julia, when I first moved here, I knew bugger all about the Easter Rising. I knew that it had happened. Like my first trip into Dublin. I lived in a wee town in Wicklow, and they had this thing called the culture bus. Where people in the village would go into Dublin and so forth, being pointed out to me, and there's the GPO where the Horizon was. And I thought, oh, that's nice. What's that?
Exactly.
I didn't know. Right? So as I say, I've had to learn the whole thing. I become like a serious Irish history buff because it's so bloody rich, going back into prehistoric times. But it's the perfect primer, and you didn't, shall we say, dumb it down at all. No,
Good.
full kudos to you. So, are you hooked now? Are you looking to ease away from the PI life, and be a literary figure, shall we say?
Well, yeah, it's certainly, once you do your first one, I mean, I was very intimidated by that. I would come to each scene. I'm like, okay, I made this decision to write the book and try to tell this story. And then I would come to a scene and I would think, oh my God, how am I going to handle this? I mean, I hadn't thought it. If I had thought about it much more, I don't think I would have done it because I would have talked myself out of it. Like you mentioned the part 2 with the battle scenes, and
yeah.
I'm fine having some main character ruminate about their inner feelings and kind of do the Hamlet thing, and worry about what they should do and think, But when it came to describing things in the Rising, things were exploding and burning, and for a week straight, this stuff was going on, and I hadn't even thought about the fact that I was going to have to, figure out how to describe that effectively. And I was very, so anyway, that's a long way of saying, I mean, now that I've proven that I could at least get through the whole thing, I could do the 300 pages and have it be at least coherent and enjoyable. To some people, I would love to do another book. I am hooked. I have been waiting for some story to come out and grab me the way that Going Great did. And I'm starting to think that might not happen again. That might have just been the thing I needed for that first book.
No, it'll happen. It'll happen.
It'll happen.
The story will tell you that it wants to be written, same as this one did. I suspect, and in particular when you were talking about the battle scenes, that being a PI probably really helped you because you have to be so attentive to detail and accurate and clear in your day-to-day job. It's like Thomas Hardy was a land surveyor, and as such, he had the same sort of clarity in talking about scenes and buildings in the English countryside. Do you think being a PI helped, or am I talking out of my arse?
No, I think specifically for the type of writing I've had to do. I mean, I've always private investigators are not necessarily known for doing the greatest writing and some are really good and some aren't. And I had really good examples, mentors that I worked with who were just really, really, really great writers in their reports. Of course, nobody ever gets to read them but the legal team. So it's you don't get an audience, but I've worked really, really hard, and you do have to have a huge amount of clarity, and you can't go off and do your impression. You have to be very aware of what your opinions are, as opposed to what the facts are. Because any of your reports as an investigator, every time I'm writing a report as an investigator, I'm imagining myself in trial having to testify and having the prosecutor yelling at me because I didn't get one fact exactly right. So the clarity, observation, and the separating what is actually fact from what is your impression of whether somebody's telling the truth or not. You do have to learn, to be very precise. And I've always been what's the cliche, the more right-brained, artsy kind of person. And this was really, really good for me because I really had to learn to think in a coherent, systematic way. And in fact, I feel like my challenge next time I write a book would be to be able to let go a little more, because I feel like I've actually gone pretty far over that side. And so,
for sure,
I would
have. You mentioned that your dad was a writer. What sort of stuff did he write?
Well, he raised me on his own since I was a baby, and he was a single father, and he was a student, and he was, English literature major, his bachelor's and master's degree. So he was writing all kinds of things.
So
and
how
then,
long did he drive taxi? Sorry, but I was an English major too. And it doesn't lead to fabulous careers. But pardon me.
Yeah,
Do carry
yeah.
on.
We were very, very poor, and he actually worked on other things as little as possible so he could raise me full time. So, I wasn't staying with other people or anything. So basically it was sort of, as far as putting the money together, it was pretty patchwork, just a little bit here and a little bit there wherever he could get it. And, he would sell articles to magazines and things like that. And he did eventually go, the commercial route and try to, he did sell actually a book in the occult market.
Oh,
It was
really?
the 80s, and so things were that was very popular. But he had a horrible, traumatic. I think I don't want to talk too much about him since he's not here to talk for himself. But
Yeah.
it was a heartbreaking experience dealing with New York and the publishers and the agents. And I feel I got perhaps too strong of an opinion about that too early. But I felt that they were basically often, as far as new writers go, that don't have any leverage, don't have any name, kind of chewing people up and spitting them out and getting what they needed. And so that was a hard time for him as a writer. And I don't know, but the main important thing is that words and books were always such an important part of my life. And he would read when he would read to me before bed. He read to me every night before I went to sleep since I was a little tiny kid, which was pretty much, I think, my favorite memories of my childhood. And he would read adult books. He was reading me Hemingway and Joseph Conrad, and he was reading books that he wanted to read. And it was a really great education, and we talked a lot about words, and we talked, I remember when my first simile, when I was 6 or something, and